Hey folks, Colin here from Something's Recording, and today we're going to do a little comparison video. We're going to look at the Waves API 550 EQ in comparison to the Presonus Alpine EQ 550. We're going to put them head to head in a couple of different situations here and see which one comes out stronger. We're going to be messing with two API 550 emulations today, but before we dive in, if you are looking to dial in a repeatable workflow for getting professional sounding drum mixes, then I want you to go through my 3-step framework for mixing drums workshop. This workshop will walk you through the 3-step process I use on almost every mix for creating pro drum mixes right from your home studio. It's a 100% free to watch on-demand video training. Just click the link below in the video description and you can get access to that. Now let's jump in here and take a look at these different API emulations. Let me start by playing you the mix as it stands here. This actually isn't a mix at all. These are raw tracks here. I usually use an API 550 EQ when I'm doing EQing on the way-in. So on drums and on guitars, if I need to add a little bit of stuff, I will throw on an API EQ here on the board or down below in outboard gear just to get that little extra oomph on the way in here. So we're going to look at raw tracks here, throwing the API 550 EQ on. We'll look at drums and we'll look at guitars here, and we'll see which one kind of suits the different instruments better. But let me play you where we're standing here with this track. So these are raw tracks just going into some mix bus processing here, and we're going to get rid of some of this extra stuff that we don't need here on our mix bus at the moment. So I'm going to hit play here. This is just mix bus processing, raw tracks other than that. We're going to start off by looking at the drums. It's probably the place I use an API most often is across my drums on the way in here. So if we look up, I already have my normal processing on the way in here. This is my recording processing. So if we look at our kick in here, you'll see I have my normal processing going here on the kick in. We have the Alpine 550 EQ, and then a DBX 160 style emulation here. That's what I normally use across my drums on the way in as an API, and then a compressor of some sort on each individual track here. That's just the recording processing. We're going to see what we can get with the Waves API in comparison to the Alpine EQ here. So we'll first look at what the Alpine EQ is doing here on our kick drum. So here's our kick in without it, and then I will kick it in. You can hear the difference that we're getting with this EQ. Quite a drastic difference here. What we're doing, the biggest move we're making here is we're cutting 12 dB at about 800 hertz here. That's getting rid of all of that kind of mid-range slap that we don't need. All of that's coming out at 800 there, all 12 dB of it. Then on the low end here, not using shelves, bear in mind, just straight bell curves here, we're doing 4 dB boost at 50 hertz, and then on the top end, another 4 dB boost at 7K here. One more time with and without, and then we'll pull in our Waves plugin and see what we can get just without it, and then we'll see if we can do the same settings and compare them here. So that sounded pretty good there. It's one of the reasons I like this EQ so much. It's so simple, just 3 knobs, 3 different controls here for frequency. Just pick which one you want on each of them and pull them up or down. It's really simple to use and it sounds really, really good. Let's pull in the Waves API here, the mono one, of course. We're on a mono track. I actually just pulled in the demos for these plugins so I could compare them to the Alpine EQ. I use the Alpine EQ across my entire mix here, usually on the way in on the drums. So I wanted to see what we'd get if we'd use a paid plugin here. Same kind of controls because it's emulating the same plugin. We'll switch the low and the high frequency here to the bell curves here. We'll see what we can get by turning the analog noise on and off, but we're going to start here. We'll hit play, and I'm going to see what we can get sound-wise before we try and compare the same kind of moves on each EQ. Mid-range is very, very smooth. That's pretty typical of an API, nice smooth mid-range. Let's see what we can get with our low end and top end now. That sounded really good to me. Let me see what happens if we flip the analog noise on. See if it gets a little fatter, or if we get anything from that. It does seem like it makes our low end a little bit fatter, but it seems to smear things. And I don't know if I like that very much. Something about it in API EQ, it's very smooth in the mid-range, but the high end is very, very pretty as well. We're going to mess with the higher frequencies here and boost them up and down so you can see. It's very focused as well, especially if you switch to the bell curves here. The low end is very focused when we're switching from 50 to 100 hertz there. 100 hertz is very, very tight, and it has that higher point on the fundamental. And then down at 50 hertz here, it's very big and very fat sounding. We're going to go back to where we had it here at the 2 dB boost on 50. Let's see where we are sitting on the Alpine EQ here. So with our Alpine EQ, we're doing 4 dB at 50, 12 down at 800, same thing there, and then 4 dB at 7K. We're doing 4 dB at 7K. The only difference we have right now is that we're only at 2 dB here on the API, the 550, the Waves EQ here. I want to see what our comparison is at the moment here, because that 2 dB boost is sounding like it's enough for me on the Waves. We might just be getting more low end from this boost on our Waves EQ. Let's see here. We'll compare each one. We'll start with our Alpine EQ, and then we'll switch back over to our Waves API EQ. So here's the Alpine, here's the Presonus EQ, and then we're going to switch over to the Waves one. The opposite effect kind of seems to be happening on the top end and the bottom end for each plugin. For me, I feel like I'm getting more out of the top end on the Alpine 550 EQ. I feel like I'm getting more of that 7K slap that I want on the beater from the kick-in mic. Whereas doing the same 4 dB boost at 50 on the Waves API EQ, I feel like I'm getting more low end than I am out of the 4 dB boost on the Alpine EQ here. Now the mid-range cuts, to me, it feels like the Waves API EQ is wider. It feels like a wider cut. The Alpine EQ feels more focused. That may be why we're getting more low end from the Waves EQ. It might be a wider bandwidth than the Alpine 550 EQ here, and that may be why our top end feels more focused here. I want to see what happens if we flip the analog noise on now, and we'll compare them both one more time. So we'll start with, again, the Alpine EQ, and we'll flip over to the Waves one. That actually feels closer in comparison to me throwing the analog noise on. That's kind of funny. But to me, those are my first impressions from it. It feels like the Waves API is a little bit wider, so we get more from the low end from it, but the Alpine 550 is more focused, especially in terms of the top end and pulling down the mid-range. We're getting a wider cut from the Waves one. That's an interesting start here. Let's move on over. We'll try it on snare drum here. And then I want to try it, of course, on maybe a pair of guitars and see what we can get, because that's really the test for mid-range on an EQ for me, is seeing what they can do for guitars. If we're looking at our snare top here, I'll turn off our compressor. Just simple little moves here on our snare top. Take a listen here, and I'll A/B the Alpine EQ here on the snare top. Waking up our top end a little bit, a 4 dB boost at 5K. Again, these are bell curves. And then a 2 dB boost at 100 just to give it some low end weight and make it feel a bit bigger here. Let's pull in the API EQ here on our snare top. Again, the mono one, because we are in mono here. And let's see what we can get with this here. I'm going to turn off the Alpine EQ. Just going to do a little bit of work with the Waves API, see what kind of sound we can get out of our snare drum. And we'll have to flip them to bell curves as well. I ended up going 4 and 2, same way on the Alpine. When I first started here, I did 2 dB boost up at the top end at the 5K frequency, and that felt like enough for me. But that 2 dB at 100 hertz here on the Waves one was so much weight that I had to go up to that 4 dB up top. Well, let me A/B just this one here, and then we'll compare them both together. Again, that top end is really, really pretty here on the Waves API EQ. That's something that you're always going to get from an API style plugin, is really, really pretty top end. Let's compare them now. We'll start back with our Alpine style EQ here. I'll throw them both up on the screen for you here. So here's the Alpine, and then here's our Waves API style EQ. we're going to start with the Alpine here, and then we'll flip over and we will do our API EQs. Starting with the Alpine, flipping over to the API. Initial reactions here, it feels like the API is just more than the Alpine EQ. Let me bump both of these up to the next notch here, and we'll compare one more time. That definitely feels closer. So that's funny. Our API is just giving us more for less boosts. We're doing a 4 dB boost here at 5K and a 2 dB boost at 100 Hertz. And then over here on the Alpine EQ, to kind of get the same effect, we're doing a 4 dB boost at 100 and a 6 dB boost up at our 5K here. So it's just more. That's kind of crazy, but let's see what happens, of course, if we throw the analog on, see if it puts us closer like it did with our kick drum. Analog noise seemed to tame down the Waves API EQ a little bit and put them closer together without having to do the extra boosts on the Alpine EQ. That's interesting there. We're just getting more from our API EQ than we are from our Alpine there on our snare drum. Throw our compressors back in on our two plugins on our kick and our snare. And we're going to move over. We're going to try it on a pair of guitars here. Probably my favorite test for any kind of mid-range on a plugin is seeing what we can get in the mid-range here. We'll pull in both of them, so we'll pull in a fat channel here and pull up our Alpine EQ first, and then we'll pull in the Waves API EQ and do the same kind of thing. Let's see what we can get from our mid-range here, probably up at 1.5K here. Even just a 2 dB boost, see what it does for our pair of guitars here on this track. I did a 2 dB boost at 200 too, but that feels really, really good. Feels really fat on this pair of guitars here. They are the only guitars in the song, so making them that big, probably going to serve the song pretty well. So we're doing a 2 dB boost here at 1.5K and a 2 dB boost at 200. That's sounding pretty fat and pretty big on our guitars here. Now let's move over and do the same kind of thing, or at least get going here on our Waves API EQ. Then we'll do a comparison between the two. I'm going to turn off the Alpine EQ here. This is just the Waves API EQ now. And I put the mono one on. We're going to need the stereo one. We are on a stereo channel here. There we go. I think we're getting more low end from the Alpine EQ just listening to what we're getting out of the API, but let's pull both of them up now. So here's our API. Here's our Alpine EQ. Let's start with the Alpine EQ here. It doesn't feel like the low end's doing as much up at 200 as it is on the Alpine EQ, but we're going to see here as we put them head to head. The mid-range was quite a volume difference. Definitely brought up some presence there in the mid-range, doing the 2 dB at 1.5, but let's put them head to head here now. So starting with the Alpine EQ and flipping over to the API. Couple things. We're definitely getting more low end, more 200 hertz from the Alpine EQ, doing that 2 dB boost, than we are with the API. So probably different curves there as we go up higher with our frequencies. That's interesting to see, but I like what we're getting from our mid-range more on the Waves API, I think, than we are on the Alpine EQ here. Those are my initial reactions listening to those two plugins head-to-head on guitar here. So summing things up here, on kick drum, probably going to reach for the Alpine EQ before I would reach for the Waves API 50. I like the focus more of the Alpine EQ. Again, it feels narrower. The Waves API EQ feels wider with its boosts and its cuts, and that's okay. That would suit better for some. On the snare drum, I don't know, we're getting more from that 100 hertz boost than the Alpine EQ. I would probably reach for that Waves API. I like that 100 hertz boost there, and I like that top end boost at 5K. That felt really, really sweet on the snare drum. Now on guitars, that's a tough call. I like the low end better at 200. We get more bang for our buck with the Alpine EQ on that 200 boost, but the mid-range on the Waves API, that's unbeatable there. That sounds really, really nice. It's going to be different for each situation you use each EQ, and each one gives you a different kind of effect. Like I said, the Alpine EQ feels more focused to me, and the Waves API feels a little bit more broadband, which is probably what you want when you have those, 3 bands and 3 knobs. You're probably doing wideband stuff. Maybe that's more suited for that, but I do like the focus of the Alpine EQ here from Presonus. I hope that was helpful for you. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, if you are looking to level up your drum mixes, then I want you to go through my 3-step framework for mixing drums workshop. It is a completely 100% free workshop, and you can click the link below to get access to that and take your drum mixes to the next level. Thank you so much for watching today, and I will see you in the next video.